It was a quiet night inside a small roadside bar, the kind of place most people passed without noticing. Dim yellow lights hung low from the ceiling, casting soft shadows across worn wooden tables. A slow song played in the background, barely, loud enough to cover the low hum of conversation. Behind the counter, a young bartender moved calmly, wiping down glasses, keeping to himself. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, just doing his job, the way he always did. Most of the customers barely paid him any attention, except one. The door suddenly swung open with force, slamming against the wall hard enough to turn every head in the room. Heavy footsteps followed as a tall man walked in, his presence loud before he even spoke. His expression carried arrogance, the kind that demanded attention without earning it. He walked straight to the counter and dropped into a chair, leaning forward aggressively. "Hey," he snapped, tapping the counter loudly. "You deaf or something?" The bartender looked up, slightly startled, but composed. "What can I get you, sir?" The man scoffed, shaking his head like he was already annoyed. "Finally, took you long enough." A few people exchanged glances. The energy in the room shifted, subtle, but noticeable. "Whiskey," the man said, slamming his hand on the counter again. "And make it quick." The bartender nodded and turned to prepare the drink, his movements steady, controlled. No attitude. No reaction. But that only seemed to make things worse. "Unbelievable," the man muttered loudly, looking around the bar as if inviting others to agree with him. "This place hires anyone these days." A couple sitting nearby lowered their voices. Someone in the corner stopped mid-sentence. The tension was building, slowly tightening like a knot no one wanted to acknowledge. The bartender returned with the glass and placed it gently in front of him. "Here you go, sir." The man stared at it, then back at the bartender, unimpressed. "This is it," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You call this service?" He picked up the glass, looked at it for a second, then slammed it back down hard enough for some of the liquid to spill over the edge. The room went quieter. No one moved, no one spoke. And in the far corner of the bar, sitting quietly in the shadows, someone had been watching the entire time. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, but something about him felt different. And in just a few moments, everything in that bar was about to change. The bartender didn't react to the outburst. He simply reached for a cloth and calmly wiped the spilled drink from the counter, his expression steady, controlled. It was clear he had dealt with difficult customers before. Still, there was something different about this situation, something heavier. "I can remake it if you'd like," he said politely. The man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Remake it?" he repeated. "You think that's the problem?" A few people nearby shifted in their seats, sensing where this was going. "You don't even know how to pour a proper drink," the man continued, his voice louder now. "And they've got you running the place like you actually matter." The bartender stayed quiet. No argument, no attitude, just patience. But the silence only seemed to fuel the man's ego. "Look at you," he added, leaning forward with a smirk. "Standing there like you've got dignity or something." The words hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. Across the room, a couple exchanged uneasy glances. Someone near the door quietly reached for their phone, sensing this might turn into something worth recording. And still the bartender didn't respond. "I'm just here to do my job, sir," he said finally, his tone respectful but firm. That was enough. The man's smirk faded slightly, replaced by irritation. "Oh, now you want to talk back?" he snapped. At that moment, the tension in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Because sitting quietly in the far corner, partially hidden by shadow, a man slowly lifted his gaze. He had been silent this entire time, watching, listening. And now, for the first time, he was paying attention. The man at the counter leaned back slightly, letting out a slow, mocking laugh as he stared at the bartender. "Do your job?" he repeated. "That's what you call this?" He picked up the glass again, swirling the whiskey lazily before setting it down with a sharp tap. "I've had better service in places that don't even deserve to be called bars," he added, loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear him. The bartender kept his posture straight, hands resting lightly on the counter. His calm wasn't weakness, it was restraint. But to the wrong person, restraint looks like an invitation. And that's exactly how the man took it. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, pointing a finger directly at him. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." A quiet murmur passed through the room. No one stepped in, no one interrupted. People were watching now, fully invested but keeping their distance. "I asked for a simple drink," the man said, his voice rising again. "And somehow you still managed to mess that up." "I didn't," the bartender began calmly. "Don't interrupt me," the man snapped suddenly, slamming his palm against the counter so hard the glasses behind it rattled. The sharp sound echoed across the bar, silencing what little conversation remained. For a brief second, everything stood still. The bartender inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "Sir, there's no need to raise your voice." That sentence, simple as it was, hit the man's ego like a spark to dry fuel. "No need?" he repeated, leaning forward aggressively. "You think you get to tell me what I need?" A chair scraped loudly somewhere behind him as someone shifted uncomfortably. "People like you," the man continued, shaking his head, "always act like you're better than you are." He grabbed the glass again, this time tighter, and slammed it down even harder, spilling more liquid across the counter. "Clean that up," he said, his tone now cold and commanding. "That's what you're here for, right?" The bartender didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, but because something had clearly crossed a line. Still, he reached for the cloth, again silently doing exactly what was asked, and that's when it happened. The man reached forward and shoved the bartender's hand away mid-motion. Not hard enough to injure, but more than enough to humiliate. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "That's too much." Phones were no longer hidden. A few people had already started recording openly now, their screens glowing faintly in the dim light. The bartender froze for just a moment, then slowly pulled his hand back, his expression tightening ever so slightly. It was the first crack in his calm. "I'm asking you to stop," he said quietly. But the man only smiled. A slow, arrogant smile. "Oh, now you're asking," he said. "Or is that supposed to be a warning?" The tension in the bar had reached a breaking point. Everyone could feel it. And in the far corner, the man who had been silent this entire time finally moved. Not much, just enough to shift forward in his seat. His eyes now fixed directly on the situation. The air changed instantly, because something about his presence wasn't calm anymore. It was focused, and whatever was about to happen next, no one in that room was ready for it. The shift was subtle. Most people in the bar didn't notice it at first, but those closest to the situation felt it immediately. From the far corner, the quiet man slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The dim light finally caught part of his face, calm, unreadable but focused. He had been watching everything, every word, every movement, and now he had seen enough. At the counter, the aggressor was still smirking, feeding off the silence around him. "What's wrong?" he mocked, looking at the bartender. "Ran out of polite words?" The bartender didn't answer this time. He simply stood there, composed but no longer engaging. That only made the man more irritated. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "People like you shouldn't even be allowed to—" "That's enough." The voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, but it cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned instantly. The man at the counter paused, his expression tightening as he looked over his shoulder. For the first time, his attention shifted away from the bartender, toward the corner. The quiet man had stood up, slowly. No sudden movement, no aggression, just presence. He stepped forward, one measured step at a time, his gaze steady and locked on the situation. "Mind your business," the aggressor snapped, trying to regain control of the moment. But there was something in the air now that hadn't been there before. A shift, a weight, the kind that makes people instinctively step back without knowing why. The man didn't respond immediately. He kept walking, calm, controlled, until he was close enough to be clearly seen. The lighting revealed more of his face now. A few people in the crowd squinted, recognition beginning to form. "Hey," someone whispered from the side. "Is that—" But the sentence never finished, because the tension had already taken over. The aggressor stood up from his chair, turning fully now to face him. "You got something to say?" he challenged, puffing his chest slightly. The man stopped just a few feet away, close enough to intervene, far enough to avoid escalation. "Yes," he said calmly. The single word carried more weight than any shout. The room fell completely silent. Even the music in the background seemed to fade into nothing. "You don't treat people like that," he continued, his tone even, controlled. "Not here, not anywhere." There was no anger in his voice, no emotion at all. And somehow, that made it more powerful. The aggressor let out a short laugh, trying to brush it off. "Oh yeah?" he said. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt tight, like it could snap at any second. The aggressor stared, trying to read the man in front of him, but there was nothing to read. No anger, no fear, no hesitation. Just stillness. And that stillness was unsettling. Then he scoffed, shaking his head as if to brush it off. "You really think you can step in here and tell me what to do?" he said, his voice louder now, trying to pull the attention back to himself. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others raised their phones higher, recording every second. The man didn't respond. That silence only made things worse. "I'm talking to you," the aggressor snapped, stepping forward again, invading his space. Still no reaction, no flinch, no step back. That's when frustration turned into something else, something more reckless. Without warning, the aggressor shoved him, not a light push, a deliberate one, the kind meant to provoke. A ripple of shock moved through the bar. Someone gasped. Another voice whispered, "He just messed up." But the man barely moved. He absorbed the force like it was nothing, his feet staying planted, his balance untouched. That alone caused a shift in the room. The aggressor noticed it too. And it made him angrier. "What? That didn't get your attention?" he said, his tone now edged with irritation. "Or are you just gonna stand there all night?" The man finally exhaled slowly, a controlled breath. "Don't do that again," he said. The warning was quiet, but it was real. The aggressor laughed again, louder this time, more aggressive. "Or what?" he challenged. No answer. And that was the final trigger. He reached forward suddenly, grabbing the man by the front of his shirt and pulling him in, trying to dominate the space. Chairs scraped loudly as people instinctively moved back. The bartender froze behind the counter, eyes wide now. Phones were fully raised, no one hiding anymore. "Say something now," the aggressor sneered, his face inches away. That's when everything changed. It didn't look dramatic. There was no wild movement, no shouting, just one small, precise shift. The man's hand moved, fast, controlled, breaking the grip effortlessly, redirecting the aggressor's arm away from his body. Before the aggressor could react, his balance was already compromised. A simple step, a slight turn. And suddenly, he wasn't in control anymore. He stumbled forward, forced to catch himself on the edge of a table to avoid falling. A loud crash echoed as a glass tipped over and shattered on the floor. Gasps filled the room. "What the—" The aggressor turned back instantly, shocked, his confidence cracking for the first time. "What did you just—" But he didn't get to finish, because now, he was the one reacting. The man stood exactly where he had been moments ago, unmoved, untouched. Calm. I told you, he said evenly. Don't do that again. The words hit differently this time. They weren't a suggestion anymore. They were a boundary. The aggressor's breathing grew heavier, his jaw tightening as embarrassment began to creep in. He glanced around the room, and that's when he saw it. Everyone was watching. Not him, the other man. Phones pointed, whispers spreading, respect shifting. Who is that guy? Someone murmured. I don't know, but he's not normal. The bartender stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. That wasn't luck. That wasn't chance. That was control. Real control. The aggressor clenched his fists, his pride now fully on the line. You think that was something? He snapped, trying to regain his footing, both physically and mentally. But the energy had already changed, completely. And deep down, even he could feel it. He wasn't in charge anymore, not of the room, not of the situation, and definitely not of what was about to happen next. The room felt frozen for a split second, not silent in sound, but silent in movement. Every eye was locked onto the same point, every phone capturing the same moment, every breath held in anticipation. The aggressor straightened himself slowly, trying to recover what little dignity he had left. His earlier confidence had shifted into something more fragile, something forced. You got lucky, he muttered, pointing toward the man. Don't think that means anything. The man didn't react to the comment. He simply stood there, grounded, his posture relaxed but alert. That calmness was the most unsettling part of all, because it didn't look like fear, and it didn't look like arrogance either. It looked like control. The aggressor stepped forward again, this time more cautiously, but still unwilling to back down in front of the crowd. You embarrassed me, he said, his voice lower now, more tense than loud. You think you can just do that and walk away? The bartender watched from behind the counter, now visibly shaken. Others in the room had fully shifted into spectators, their attention fixed, their phones steady. No one interrupted. No one intervened. They were witnessing something real unfold. The aggressor clenched his jaw, his pride pushing him forward even as hesitation crept into his movements. Say something, he demanded. The man finally took a small step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to close the distance slightly. I already did, he replied calmly. The aggressor frowned. What does that even? Before he could finish, he lunged forward again, attempting another grab, this time faster, more desperate, driven by ego rather than control. But the outcome was the same. The man moved with precision. A subtle shift of his body redirected the attempt entirely. The aggressor's forward momentum carried him past his target, forcing him off balance again. This time he had nothing to catch himself on. He stumbled forward 2 steps, nearly losing his footing completely before regaining it at the last second. The crowd reacted immediately. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. That was clean. He didn't even hit him. Did you see that? Phones zoomed in closer. The difference was clear. There was no chaos from the man, no wild retaliation, no aggression, just controlled movement, efficient, minimal, precise. The aggressor turned back quickly, his breathing now heavier, his face flushed, not from physical strain, but from frustration and embarrassment. You think this is funny? He snapped. The man shook his head slightly. No, he said. This is unnecessary. The tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't threatening. It was almost disappointed. And that seemed to hit harder than anything else. The aggressor paused for a moment, just a moment, but long enough for doubt to creep in, because now, for the first time since this started, he realized something he hadn't considered before. He wasn't dealing with someone reacting emotionally. He was dealing with someone who was in complete control of themselves, and that made the situation unpredictable. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. No longer was it just about a confrontation between 2 individuals. It had become something else. Demonstration. A moment where intention met restraint. The man didn't advance further. He didn't chase. He didn't escalate. He simply stood his ground. That alone was enough. The aggressor's shoulders dropped slightly as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. They weren't on anyone's side. They were observing, judging, recording, and remembering. He looked around briefly, realizing how many eyes were on him now, how many devices were capturing every second. The power he thought he had at the beginning was gone, completely. And standing in front of him wasn't just an opponent. It was someone who had already proven without words that escalation wasn't necessary to win control of a situation. The man exhaled slowly. No anger, no triumph, just calm. Because he knew something the aggressor was only now beginning to understand. The fight was no longer about strength, it was about composure. And in that moment, the outcome had already been decided. The aggressor stood still for a moment, his chest rising and falling more heavily now. The energy that had carried him through arrogance and confrontation was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable: uncertainty. He looked around the room again. This time the reactions felt different. No laughter, no support, just quiet observation. Phones were still pointed in his direction, capturing every detail, every movement, every expression. The realization hit him slowly. This wasn't just a bar anymore. This was a record of everything that had just happened. The man, still standing near the center of it all, remained calm. His posture hadn't changed since the beginning of the confrontation. No signs of exhaustion, no signs of frustration, just steady composure. The bartender finally stepped out from behind the counter, cautiously approaching the scene. "Sir," he said quietly, addressing the aggressor. "I think you should take a step back." The aggressor glanced at him, then back at the man who had intervened. For the first time, he didn't have a quick response. His confidence had eroded, not because he was physically overwhelmed, but because he had lost control of the situation, in front of everyone. The door of the bar suddenly opened again, letting in a rush of cooler air from outside. A couple of people who had been watching from near the entrance stepped aside as two more individuals entered, noticing the tension immediately. But no one rushed in to escalate things further, because the situation had already peaked. The man finally spoke again, his voice calm, measured, and steady. "This didn't need to happen," he said. "No anger, no accusation, just a statement." The aggressor looked at him, this time without interrupting. "You had a choice," the man continued. "At every step." The words weren't delivered as a lecture, they were simply a reflection of what had already unfolded. The bartender nodded slightly in agreement, still processing everything he had witnessed. Around the room, people began to relax, just slightly, shoulders lowered, breathing normalized. The intensity that had built up earlier was slowly dissipating, but the impact of the moment remained. The aggressor shifted his weight, clearly conflicted now. Pride still lingered, but it no longer had the strength to drive his actions. He glanced at the shattered glass on the floor, then back at the counter, then at the phones pointed toward him. Finally, he exhaled. He started, then paused. For a moment, it seemed like he might continue pushing forward, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped back. One step, then another, not dramatic, not announced, just a quiet retreat from a situation that had already slipped beyond his control. The man didn't follow him, didn't speak further, didn't react. He simply watched as the distance between them increased. That choice, of restraint over reaction, was what defined the moment. The aggressor turned slightly toward the exit, hesitating for a second as if considering whether to say something more. But no words came. He walked away. The door opened, then closed behind him. Silence filled the bar once again. Not the tense silence from before, but a calmer, reflective one. People slowly began lowering their phones. Some exchanged glances. Others whispered quietly among themselves. "That could have gone way worse," someone said. "Yeah," another replied. But he handled it without losing control. The bartender stood still for a moment, then exhaled deeply, as if releasing the weight of everything that had just happened. "Thank you," he said, looking toward the man. The man gave a slight nod. Nothing more. No attention-seeking. No acknowledgement of victory. Just a simple response. Because for him, the outcome was never about proving something. It was about preventing escalation. And that message lingered in the room longer than anything else. Moments later, the atmosphere of the bar slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before. Music played again, softer at first, then gradually filling the background once more. But something had changed. Not visibly, not loudly, but internally. Everyone who had witnessed it understood one thing clearly. Strength wasn't always about force. Control wasn't about domination, and respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be demonstrated. The man returned to his seat, unbothered, as if the entire confrontation had been just another passing moment in an otherwise ordinary evening. But for everyone else, it wasn't ordinary at all. It was a reminder that in situations where emotions run high and pride takes over, the ability to remain calm can shift the entire outcome, and that sometimes the most powerful response isn't action, it's restraint. The night continued and the bar gradually settled back into its usual rhythm. One lesson remained with those who had seen it unfold firsthand. You don't need to escalate to be in control. You only need to stay composed when others cannot, and that's what truly changes everything.